Yeah. So lovely to have you here, Deena.
Thank you.
So welcome to the Homeschool Mama Self-Care Patreon community. And you have been part of the Homeschool Mama Book Club. And I've heard so many very engaged, interesting things that you had to ask or offer. And so I'm so glad you're here to share your expertise.
Thank you. It's so nice to be here. It's such an awesome community.
Yeah. So tell me, Deena, for those that haven't met you, would you share about your homeschool story, how you got into homeschooling?
Sure. We've been homeschooling, like as far as school age is concerned, for 2 years. My son is 7. I would say that I never intended to homeschool. It was just something that I think I thought of as this very fringe, bizarre thing that people did. It was like when I knew I wanted to have a child, it was just never on the radar that I would homeschool.
Yeah.
I interestingly though, I didn't have a positive experience at all in school. And I've learned more and more about that over the years. But the thing that started sparking something for me was when I was 4 weeks after I'd had my son. So he was 4 weeks old. I did an infant massage class here in San Diego with Rachel Rainbolt, who a lot of people may know. She's a homeschooling educator, has unschooled 3 kids. So she was still living here in San Diego at the time, and she led the infant massage class. And while we're all sitting there, newly postpartum, massaging our babies, singing songs, Rachel is just lovingly giving us information about respectful parenting. And her son, one of her sons, was just like over on the side because they're a homeschooling family. He was maybe like 5 or 6 at the time. Yeah. And that was like the bug in my ear that started. And then I was continually learning from her over the years. And then I just casually, even when Zeke was 2 or 3, I was getting more and more, I found myself listening to homeschooling podcasts. And then came his entering kindergarten year, and I toured 7 or 8 schools in February of 2020 because his kindergarten year would have been fall of 2020. And I toured everything. I toured private schools, I toured charter schools, I toured public schools, I toured more of like enrichment center kind of hybrid schools. I toured them all. Nothing felt like the right fit. And then March of 2020 came. Very clear to me that Zeke was not going to be going to school that fall. Like over the next couple months, I was like, well, there's no way, you don't, we live in California, you don't have to do kindergarten here. And so I thought, okay, well, I guess we're starting homeschooling. And that was that, right? It's like once I really got into it, once I started, I read the book club that we did together was Julie Bogart, Raising Critical Thinkers, but it was in April of 2020, sitting in my driveway, being outside with Zeke, but no one else around, where I read Brave Learner. And I had read Free to Learn by Peter Gray. And I had already really, once you start down this path, you realize like it's amazing. It's super hard and there's a lot of challenges, but it is so rich and fulfilling and incredible. And it just really, we cater our lives with that. And so, yeah, here we are. My son will be, it's so funny. I don't even think about grades anymore. Yeah. Like it's the number one question. Like, people see him anywhere we go. How old are you? What grade are you in? It's just
exactly.
It's like, this is the only thing that we can come up with to
ask. Like literally nobody will ask us adults, how old are you? What's your name?
Right, exactly. What did you recently study? Like, what are you liking learning these days? Like, I would love if someone asked me that question. No one asks me that question anymore. But yeah, so he will be in, quote unquote, 2nd grade this fall, but we have some lovely enrichment programs and he does a great nature program. And I would say we are definitely unschoolers, and it's beautiful. So
yeah,
we are.
Beautiful. Yeah, I identify very closely with that notion of no way, Jose, am I going down that homeschool path. In fact, it didn't even register. It wasn't even on the radar for me.
It wasn't on the radar for me either. It's like I kind of knew of it, but it wasn't even a consideration.
No. And then obviously everybody did it, or at least they were at home doing some sort of educational thing with their kids. But you got to tour all sorts of different schools. I don't have options like that at all where I am. So right. that is pretty remarkable that you've got all these options and you chose the homeschool path, when you're obviously rubbing shoulders with a lot of people that are in a different, system, or a lot of educational systems that you aren't, or a lot of different schools, are you starting to see differences between the two?
Between homeschooling and these other schools?
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, there's differences across the board. And the interesting thing is, now that we're 2 years in, I feel like in fall of 2021, the people that chose homeschooling that were like around Zeke's age, maybe a year older or younger or whatever, still stuck with it again this past year. And now I'm seeing the kind of true colors of who's really wanting to stick with this, who, like the people that are like really aligned with it versus having chosen it for the past couple of years. And that's been really big, because a lot of the friends now are going to be enrolling in full schools.
Right.
There's so many, like we said, there's a lot of different styles around, but
yeah, I guess I'm thinking two things. One is that I've never intentionally chosen friends because they were homeschool or not homeschool. Maybe in the first few years I was looking for that, and then discovered that that is not the basis for friendship, is whether your mom signed you up to homeschool.
Yeah, it's such a good point. And so we'll be continuing and building friendships with people that spend their time in all different ways, which is the real world. Like that's how we engage with people.
Yeah, that's right. Well, I'm so glad that you've enjoyed it and that you feel like you're aligned with it. When you said that the homeschooling is can be really hard, I would love to hear your thoughts about what elements are hard. And I'm with you, because it is. And I think it's also just parenting is hard, because, and I think I saw this on your website, which I read through the entire website, and was like, your heart and my heart, very similar. There's very similar overlaps, which I'll share as we continue. But yeah, it is hard, but it's like a mirrored reflection of who you are. And you discover that you have some stuff to work on. That's what you learn as a parent, but because you're homeschooling, you get to do it more.
Yeah.
So what have you learned?
Yeah, I think, what I've really been embracing over the past couple of years, and I even talk about this a lot in my work, is just how when you can really lean into like how you do one thing is how you do everything. It helps, I think it's like resting into and trusting who you really are and honoring that. And what I have really learned about myself in the past several years is just how much I've not been okay with just the status quo. When I like look back on how it was for me, even when I was in school, when I was a young child, and things that I would find to be unfair, or why do I have to do it this way? Or why is the teacher saying this? Or things maybe in my family or whatever, I'm a highly sensitive person, and I feel the energy around me very much, but also I'm very tuned in with like how people are being treated, and the just the basic question of why. Why is a question I've always asked. Why is it this way? Why does it need to be this way? And for most of my life, I was met with, it's just how it is. It is what it is. That's the way it goes. And I think into adulthood, we start to see whether it's like the educational system or healthcare or politics, or how we care for our bodies individually, the foods we choose, our relationships, if our romantic partnership, our husbands, our wives, our spouses, the conscious parenting, there's all of these elements. You can see the threads throughout of the status quo, like the typical way of doing things, and then the way where, if you for me, being bold enough to come forward and say, why does it have to be this way? And so doing that, like, I think that's what I mean by it's not the easier path, right? The quote unquote easier path is to just do what other people are doing, to keep walking that line, staying in that rhythm, and that's the life.
Yes.
But it's not, it's just, I've come to realize like, it's not my life. It's not how I see the world. And so I am always questioning why. I am wanting to dig deeper. I'm wanting to get to the root of things. And So it makes sense that it came up with learning and
Yes.
asking, well, why does someone need to go to a place to learn a curriculum, some arbitrary system that's been created that really doesn't meet my child's needs, or
Yeah.
I ask that question so much. I have a lot of chronic health issues, which we can talk about because it's definitely shaped my story. But in the mainstream medical system, I would ask, well, why is this happening? And the answer was always, well, we don't know why. We don't really ask why, but I can offer this thing to you that might help the symptoms that are presenting themselves, right?
Yeah.
So it's you see those threads throughout.
Yeah.
And I love getting to the root cause. I love getting to like, well, what influenced me this way? Why is the world the way it is?
Thank you, the way it is. Yeah.
How can I steer that boat in the other direction, at least for me and for my family, and therefore for future generations.
Greater. Yeah. So that's amazing because homeschooling does really strengthen your independent bone.
Yes.
You're constantly asked about your choice, and at least for me, and I see a lot of other people do this, we get very defensive. And we want to explain everything. We either want like to come right out of the door, out the barn door and go, hey, this is like the 100 reasons why I'm doing this.
Yes.
When somebody's just asking our kid randomly, is school out today?
Yep.
And we're like, oh, no, we don't have to defend homeschooling, and we don't have to defend our choice. Usually they're not asking all that stuff. But even if they are asking all that stuff, gradually we grow into I'm not even hearing their questions. I don't even really care what they're really thinking about my choice. I'm just doing my thing. And if they see the value and benefit of it, great, but I don't need to defend it. So then it grows you into a stronger person, separate thinking, or you think more independently. So that bone will continue to grow.
Yeah.
So I want to switch gears a little bit because I can see we could just chat in all different directions, which is fabulous. And I'm so not surprised. So your coaching story, you are a holistic, okay, tell me how you say this, holistic integrative coach?
Integrative. So integrating different modalities. Yeah.
Okay.
Holistic integrative health coach. Yeah.
So tell me how you got into that.
Sure. So as I mentioned before, growing up, I had, looking back, it's like from childhood in these different health issues. As a child, I would get like throat infections a lot. And I always had gut, digestive issues. No one paid much attention to it. If I got a throat infection, I got some antibiotics, I maybe stayed home, maybe I didn't, and just move along. The digestive issues, tons of people have digestive issues in my family. Now we understand that there's a lot of autoimmune in my family, but we didn't know that. I'm 42, so I grew up in the 80s. I was born in 1980. In the 80s and 90s, this was not something that people were talking about. In my home, I grew up in a completely like mainstream, conventional health. There was no talk of wellness, no talk of nutrition.
No. I was eating bologna and cheese slice sandwiches.
Exactly. I was just eating whatever it was. I had one dear friend that I met in middle school growing up, who's still a super close friend of mine. And she was like, that was the health nut family, where like, if we went over her house, all we could have was like dried fruit and nuts. And it sucked. So that was like my only exposure to that.
Yeah.
But I grew up with these health issues. I also grew up in a home and in an environment where every woman I knew, whether it was my grandmother, my mom, aunts, cousins, friends, mothers, teachers, every woman that I was exposed to, and probably men, but I just wasn't tuned into that, had a tumultuous relationship with food.
Yeah.
It was food, right? Yes.
And their weight scale. Yeah.
Yep, exactly. Food was something to manage. You were either on some bizarre diet or between diets, you were either kind of binging and going off the wagon, as they say, and then back on a diet, talking about it a lot, talking about things that I should or should not have eaten. So that was what I grew up with. And I just knew that like, it was just fully understood that food was something to manage, especially for women.
Yeah.
As I mentioned, also, I highly sensitive. I grew up in an environment where it was really hard for the people around me to just honor my highly sensitive nature. So it was more around like, you got to grow a thicker skin. You can handle this. Like,
Yeah.
when I would cry or feel things really strongly, no one really knew that that was going on.
Mhm.
So, there was conflict in my home. There were all sorts of things going on.
Yeah.
And so all of that put together, and many, many different reasons, as a teenager, I developed an eating disorder. So I started to be bulimic, which is I was vomiting my food after eating.
Yeah.
That started around age 14. It was also like the mid 90s, and a lot of the like an eating disorder was somewhat
Newish. Yeah.
it was newish, but it was also like not, it was a little bit trendy. Like it was a thing to be aware of that you could lean on, right? Some of my friends, like I had friends who just didn't eat much. So there was like leaning more towards anorexia. For me, I would manage my food. I wouldn't eat that much. Like in high school, I remember eating like Diet Coke and pretzels. And that was my lunch. Like I wouldn't even pack a lunch, because how cool would it be to like not even have food? And then I would buy like pretzels that said low fat on them and a Diet Coke.
Low fat. I was going to say that's a low fat.
Everything was about
no
the low
butter.
fat.
Nope.
So it's just, all of those things together. And then I developed more and more health issues over time. And I didn't know, I didn't know anything about asking why at that point. It wasn't the question I was asking yet. So I was diagnosed with polycystic ovarian syndrome, and then I was put on a birth control pill for it. I was diagnosed with thyroid issues. And so it kind of kept going through my 20s is when it started to really come to a head with like chronic fatigue, thyroid, other hormonal imbalances. I was diagnosed with Crohn's, an autoimmune condition.
Wow.
It was just a lot of different diagnoses. My hair was falling out. I felt really awful. And it was in my mid 20s that I saw my first health coach. And she actually went to the nutrition program that I then went to a couple years later. And that's where I started to learn more about like the psychology of eating. Why was I even craving the foods I was craving? Like no one had ever talked about that, right? That there's reasons why we do the things we do, that there's some sort of like body wisdom that happens, that we're not just like out of nowhere losing control, no willpower, that there's actually reasons for why we do the things that we do, and why the body, the body's always trying to reach a level of homeostasis. And so things will do what they do in order for the body to achieve balance. And that was a concept I never understood, whether physiologically or emotionally. And so it really started to open my eyes of a new way of understanding health, of understanding my body, of starting to actually respect my body and trust my body. I had never trusted my body. My body was always betraying me, was the way it felt, whether it was.
And you learned that from all the women that you were.
I learned that from many places, right? Like the medical system teaches us that, because and I'm saying the mainstream medical system, because if we don't know why things happen, then they're just coming out of nowhere, right? We're not, the mainstream medical system doesn't look at the cascade of events that may lead to something. We don't have enough time.
The holistic health. Right. I know when I was doing nursing back in the 90s, they were beginning to discuss that.
Yeah. And but even still, there isn't typically enough time in
exactly
to really get into that, right? You want to, okay, what's the problem? What are you feeling? What's going on for you? And so it looks like this pathology, we'll put it in this box here and we'll offer this solution, right? It's not, I'm not bashing it. It's just a system that doesn't work for a lot of people.
It's not holistic. It's not honoring all the different elements.
It's not looking at all the
little bomb that happened.
Yeah. So we get that message, I got that message in the diet world from all the women in my family, but then the medical world, I should say, I had major surgery for scoliosis when I was 13. So my whole spine is fused, and that seemingly came out of nowhere, the extreme nature of my scoliosis, because again, back then there wasn't this we see at age 7 that you have scoliosis. Now we're going to work with your body in all these ways. It was just okay, you have scoliosis. We'll just watch and wait. And then when I was 13, it was like emergency. And
Right.
so
Exactly.
it was another sense of like my body betraying me. And there were a lot of those messages. And I didn't really start to awaken to the wisdom of the body and being able to trust and listen to the body and work together, right? It's almost as if like it's my body over here and then it's me over here, right? How do we understand all the interconnectedness of these systems? And I started to get sicker and sicker. And then at the time I was still in the corporate world. My background is in industrial and organizational psychology. I was living in New York and working in the corporate world. And I got laid off from the job I was in. And so it was like, what do I want to do? And then I went back to school. I vowed I would never go back to school after finishing my master's. And then I went back to school a year later to a school called the Institute for Integrative Nutrition in New York. And that just, I learned so much. And I will say that even before that, I had a lot of nutrition books in my tiny 200 square foot apartment. There were a lot of things that I was drawn to it. I wanted to understand. I just didn't know. And so then I got to be in school and I soaked it all up. And that's when I started my practice. And that's gone through many iterations of the areas of focus. But
so what are some of the principles that actually helped shift you towards more intuitive body wisdom, an approach to your health?
Well, there's a lot of life experiences, a lot of specific things I learned, but I will say that starting to learn about, it was a few things. One is starting to learn about traditional ways of living and eating, which I've never learned about, right? So learning about ways that people eat around the world based and specifically more like traditional cultures that are not influenced so much by Western diet and Western ways of eating.
Boxes of stuff.
Yeah, exactly. So like what do people eat and how do they eat and how do they use all parts of the animal and what are their practices and the ways of taking care of themselves? I started to learn about cultures all around the world doing similar things. But of course, whether it was like landlocked or island or Arctic or hot temperatures, you start to see this wisdom. It's like, well, how did they know? They didn't Google it. They were like, what is this inherent wisdom that actually exists? That was something that was really intriguing to me, to have an understanding of this traditional wisdom, this like kind of medicine that's passed down and these ways of taking care of the body that then science comes along and says like, oh, well, it's because this has vitamin A and this is why these cultures all choose these foods for survival and for this. And, or like, for example, preconception health and nutrition. In our Western world, we don't really think about that, right? You go off the pill and then you try to get pregnant is what most people do.
Or folic acid, you're giving folic acid.
Right, you're giving folic acid. Okay, take a prenatal and good luck to you, right? Yeah. So in so many cultures around the world, there's actually a period of time that's very honored before two people are coming together to even think of conceiving. If there's a preparation that happens for a man and a woman, right? In our culture, when we think of fertility, it's like, okay, woman, what's wrong with you? We go through all of these efforts. And then if we can't figure it out with the woman, then we're like, oh, maybe there's something going on with the man that we should look at. That's thankfully the tide is turning there as well, because we are seeing that it's like, oh, look, it's 50-50.
There's more to it. Yeah.
But those were things that started to spark for me. And then I started to learn more about something called functional medicine, which is, so it's like, it really gets to root cause. So it's not just, oh, this person is presenting with hormone imbalance, we'll just give them a hormone replacement, or this person seems depressed, we'll give them an SSRI. It's asking what might be out of balance in the body that could be causing the brain to the neurotransmitters and the whole interconnectedness of everything happening in the body that is making someone feel low, that is making someone feel has no energy. What might be going on here that maybe is presenting as depression, but what's happening, and you can say that with anything. So I started in my program and I started to just understand more and more of that, because I had all these diagnoses and it was like, I could go to an endocrinologist and a gastroenterologist and a dermatologist and a this and this and this and this, or I could start to say, what's happening.
What's really going on. Yeah.
Yeah.
Mhm.
And then it was like, well, what is the overlap between all of that and my relationship with food? What, like, what's happening with, why is my relationship with food so tumultuous? Like, what is at the root of that? And so it was a lot of digging in, and it's, look, it's an ongoing journey, and it will be, and it's really acknowledging that too. Like, even as homeschoolers, learning is a lifelong process.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah. Yeah.
The relationship with the body is a lifelong process.
Right.
So it's
Yeah.
honoring that too. And it's resting into that there isn't this like, okay, I figured it all out, check, you know?
Yeah. Yeah. No, I identify with that. Actually, in the last, I think it was January, is when I started paying attention to something that a lot of people are talking about, but is, the word slips my mind. Fasting,
Intermittent fasting.
Thank you. Yeah.
Mhm. Yep.
And so I had this habit of, well, first of all, I had a few months in the end of the pandemic where I was just sitting because I had a broken ankle. So that was a lot of fun. But then I discovered that my habit with this intermittent fasting, that my habit for eating too much chocolate at night disappeared, which I was in shock. I thought for sure this was just like something I'd locked into, but it actually disappeared because of the intermittent fasting. And never had I had a thought that it would actually not be volitional, that it wasn't really my choice. It was my body that essentially I was giving it fuel, like in a very simplistic medical angle, I guess it is. I'm giving it fuel. So therefore I'm telling it, you've got glucose, now you need insulin. Now you have too much insulin, now you need glucose, and to keep going on that cycle. So then my body is always thinking you're hungry. And I legitimately thought I was hungry because it felt hungry. But two things I've learned with that approach. And so it's very different for me how I experience this intermittent fasting. It's not like a diet the way that I did 1980s. It just is intuitive now because it feels true to what my body needs. And so I don't eat late at night the way that I was doing it. And therefore I don't wake up hungry the way that I was before. And that was a shock for me, that I know all about the insulin glucose cycle. It's part of why our body functions, but I was fueling it to essentially ask me to give it more fuel than it needed. And yeah, I mean, it's that kind of thing that I'm hearing you speak to when it comes to intuitive or body wisdom.
Yeah, I mean, it's like what I was saying, that sense of equilibrium, right? Like insulin comes in to help the body come back into balance.
Yeah.
And there's all these things that happen when we're sleeping, right? It's not a dormant time.
Right.
Like the body resting so that the body can go through all these processes that it needs to go through. But if you end your day with, a sugar spike in some way, or with chocolate, it kind of depends. There's other things at play there that, the body's utilizing, but it's true. And I think the thing is understanding that the body was a great experimental ground was something that I didn't really think about. Right. And how can we tune in with the body with love and grace and kindness and respect and try on these things is a very different way than coming across some advertisement or reading an article or hearing someone else say, oh, you should try this diet. Just do this thing because you want to lose weight or you want this. Here's a cleanse. Just go do that. Right. Like we're so inundated in this world.
Oh, yes.
And we have been, but I would say even more right now. Diets in the 80s and 90s were like something you read in a magazine or you heard that your friend
my mom was always trying a diet.
Yes.
To this day, she still is, actually. Yeah. She was telling me about her weight yesterday. And, as a daughter to a mother, I'm like, how do I engage this? I think I can't. I have to let that one go. But I hear that and I feel, you don't have to be wed to your number.
Yeah. And also, the body changes, and that also provides information, right?
Right. Yeah.
It's really like, just, to share currently, like I've gained some weight recently, and I'm also doing some work with my integrative doctor, and I'm learning that I have some mold toxicity in my body, which it totally makes sense given a lot of the things I've gone through. And hormones are funky, and my body is doing this thing where it is holding on to weight in the middle as a survival and stress response. But if one doesn't understand, and it's not that we all need to go deep into functional medicine and figure these things out, right? But there's some basic information, yet another like pro for homeschooling, where like, this is the type of stuff I want my son to grow up learning, not whatever random like stuff is taught in like a health class, you know?
Right.
I understanding that cortisol is a stress hormone that will hold weight on the body if the body is perceiving some sort of threat, because that is how we've evolutionarily evolved. Then I'm not going to berate myself about some extra belly weight because and do a whole bunch of crunches and try to do all these other things that like I used to do, because that's not what's going on here, you know? So having some body wise education and body wisdom, I think, is really supportive for families. I think it's really helpful for parents to know some of these basics so that we can help our children trust their bodies, learn about their bodies, understand that things aren't just coming out of nowhere, right? It's not just that I ate extra chocolate bars. There's something else happening in my system.
You know, that's a perfect transition into a discussion with our kids.
Yeah.
Because, you know, I know the more is caught than taught. That is always the way it is. And of course, each of our kids.
I love that phrase. I've never heard that phrase.
Really? Oh, wow.
Yes,
I did not originate that one, by the way. That one I've heard for many years. More is caught than taught. I wish it were not true.
It is true.
But it is. Look, I almost like I'm coming down from heaven right now. I don't know.
I know, it's you have this glow happening. It's beautiful.
Glow. It looks like I have yellow hair now. But anyway, we'll just go with the sun as it is. Nice to see the sun again. But you know, when we're talking about kids though, we're teaching them, and you know, I have 4 kids, so I know that how they receive the things that I am, not that I share, but that I am, is different because they come into the world differently. But we do very much infuse our kids with how to engage their bodies, how to engage food, or all those sorts of things. So let's talk about that. That's the original reason we came into this discussion, but I know generally that the things that we were already speaking to, they speak to.
Yeah.
So what would you like to share about that? Because our original title was to actually discuss how kids can learn to have, or how we can create joyful experiences in a meal with our kids.
I think that at the core of all of it is joy and pleasure and confidence for the parents.
Yeah.
And that is a part that is really tough, because most of us have come into adulthood with some baggage, some history, some whether you would say you've had a history with disordered eating, or you might classify as a tumultuous relationship with food if you were on and off a diet trying to figure things out, like it's a bit antagonistic, maybe the words of like my body betraying me resonate, or it's just like, this is a lot to manage, right? Like you have to manage your own food, and now you're a parent and you need to manage this for the children. And you need to have an understanding of like, well, how am I doing this?
Right.
And it's not something, once again, this is not one of the things that we grew up learning as an important life skill to feel confident around food.
Right.
And how do we feel confident? How do we get to know food? How do we get to know how food works with our bodies? It's an area that is filled with rules and shoulds. So, and they come from everywhere, right? Like I say this, it's from the day your children are born, right? Whether you choose to breastfeed or bottle feed, or maybe it's not a choice. Maybe there's some other reason why one of those is coming in, right? Or how often are you doing? Do you give your child milk on demand, or is it per a schedule? What does the lactation consultant say? What does the pediatrician say? What do all the moms say that are chiming in with solicited or unsolicited opinions, right? Like
mother, your aunt,
right, everybody, right? It comes in right at the start. And then, you know, maybe 4 months in, 6 months in, whenever it happens, then it's like, well, what's the right first food? Let me look at all the Instagram memes and follow this account. And, you know, it's just, it's not, it starts and it doesn't stop.
Yeah.
And then this is the common trajectory that happens for most families, is they may find that in the first couple years, their child is open to eating most foods. You puree a food for the baby, they eat it. You chop up a food when they're a toddler, they eat it. You take something with you. It's not that hard. Sometimes it's harder early on, but usually I hear around age between 3 to 5, 4 is that like really, you know, sweet spot of the child saying, nope, I'm making my own choices. And I want to assert my independence and my control, and I can choose what goes in my mouth and what doesn't. I can throw a food across the room. I can scream at you saying, yeah, and I can scream at you saying, I don't want that, whatever it is. And then that's their child expressing preferences.
Yeah.
And then what happens is, because we don't come into this with a really strong and confident, embodied, joyful, all of these things, relationship with food for ourselves. We have no understanding of like, well, what are our values around food? What do we want to do here? We're as parents, like I say, you know, all the time, I'm like, I'm winging it every day, right? Like you know, I read a lot, I learn a lot. I do feel like maybe it's more conscious than that, but it's a learning every day. And with food, it's the same. And then what happens is there's a certain point of like, for most families, where it's just all unknowing, like, how can I keep up with this? It's too stressful. My child won't eat anything that I'm putting out. And so then the list narrows and narrows and narrows. And that's what ends up happening in most families. Not all, but it's the formula that I see that happens the most.
Yes. When I was a pediatric nurse, I was taking care of, I think it was a 4-year-old who would only, said his mom, eat fish sticks and I forget what it is, but like French fries, fish sticks, and then would only watch Barney all day.
Right.
Yeah. I mean, and I was like a little concerned, but I was not a mom, so I didn't understand the dynamic.
Yeah, but it's extremely common. And then we start to understand, well, what is it with these kind of like beige foods and bland foods?
Yes, brown. Yes.
Yeah, all of the like kind of bready, cheesy, whatever it might be foods, the foods that are typically on like a kid's menu, right?
Yes.
And so you see, when you can take a step back, you can start to see that the world really caters to that, and that it's such a common thing that happens in families. And so the question of like, how do we help raise children that have a strong relationship with food? It's first of all getting curious, being able to see all of these things, like asking those questions, like, why is this happening? Where did this come from? Actually, like writing out that story or acknowledging the trajectory that it took to get you where you are, to get you as an individual, like the person listening to this, like what's your whole food story? And then what's happened in the home? You know, lots of times in a lot of families, there's some event, there's something that happens that maybe it was a stressful event or a shift in something that made food become like, oh, I'm just going to keep it easy for right now. It could be a trip. It could be a stressful event. It could be, sometimes it's just a transition, a big transition in the family. And then it's really hard to get out of that, right? Like we get into, okay, this is what we're eating. And then the child no longer wants these other things. The parents don't have the like resilience to be able to fight that battle. But in the midst of all that, what happens for the parent is, it's primarily the mothers that I work with, but I see it across the board. What happens is that their joy, any joy or pleasure that they had with food, goes away as well. So like I hear a lot, I used to love cooking. I used to love, you know, getting creative in the kitchen. I used to. And then it's like the children suck the life out of it with their strong preferences. And like it gets the, like, what's the point? What's the point of making a meal and putting on the table if nobody's going to eat it?
Yeah, no, I understand that. I mean, for kids, I definitely understand that. Everybody has different preferences. The only one that's gluten-free is the dog. But
I did not think you were gluten-free.
I won't share why, but she definitely is gluten-free.
Okay.
But everybody else, yeah, they certain kids, two of my kids of my four have very strong preferences in certain directions. And I know for me, my narrative was always, I heard this growing up, I'm sure you did too in the 80s, but the kids are starving in Africa. So you have to eat your entire plate of food,
Yeah.
which it did not make sense to me at all. Why was I eating the turnips when the kids in Africa were starving? So I've gone to Africa and I've been there twice. And I remember asking a mom who had kids the same age as me, so do your kids eat everything? Because I was always told this thing. And she's like, no, they're picky. And I went, well,
That's amazing.
it was, I was like, what? No, they're wanting my turnips. No, kids are kids.
That's an amazing story. Exactly. And so the idea here is that we don't just cater everything towards what a child will or will not eat at any given point, because as I said before, the body is always changing, the body is dynamic, and this is for sure true for our children, right?
Yeah.
But if we limit their exposure to things, to anything in life, right? I always find it helpful to, make an analogy to another area of life, because when we're talking about a topic as loaded as food, it can get really tough, right?
Yeah. I'm just going to move to see if I can see that I'm not heavenly anymore.
I can see you better now. Yeah.
Okay, good.
So it's helpful to realize the areas where we are where we are limiting, and the fact that our children are often not seeing us having joy in food, us putting together a beautiful plate of food that we love
and enjoying it. That's part of the process, is actually getting in the kitchen and doing things together, which is definitely my family's history. There's a book called French Kids Eat Everything. Have you ever read this book?
No.
This one informed me very similarly to how you're speaking about food. And I can't remember the number of this, but before a French child is one, they've eaten more foods or vegetables or fruits than most adults will in their lifetime on our side of the world. Yeah.
And it's also really helpful to look at other cultures, to have an understanding of what's going on in that culture. Now, of course, we live in the culture that we live in. Mm-hmm. Which means our children are exposed to the food that other kids are eating at the playground, the food that shows up at the birthday party, the food, all of these things, the food that is in shows that they watch, right? Like the influence is everywhere. Mm-hmm. And, food companies do a great job of marketing to children. So you can see it on packages, like all of that stuff that happens in the culture that we live in. So we do need to honor that. But I think the first step for parents is just to get curious. This is always my step one, whether I'm working one-on-one with a client, in a group program, in any of my workshops. Try to take a step back and pretend you're like an anthropologist out in the wild, and you are just observing, like, oh, look at that bird. What's that bird doing? Where's it going? How is it eating? Mm-hmm. What position, like that kind of thing. So when are people in your family hungry? What are they choosing? How are they putting food on their plates? And this is like, you're observing this for yourself too, because so often I hear from mothers in particular, they are not eating enough. They're waiting too long. Food is a chore. They're focused on their children. They're not taking anything for themselves. Like I ask parents a lot, like especially homeschooling families, when they're going out for an outing or they're going to a homeschooling meetup, okay, so you're telling me what you're packaging for your child. What about you? Oh, I was on a call with a client yesterday, and she was saying that she makes like herself a peanut butter and jelly sandwich. Mm-hmm. And I was like, do you love peanut butter and jelly? Like, and if you do, wonderful. And she was like, well, it's just easier. And so we really needed to unpack that a little bit, right? Like, what does it mean to be the parent standing over the counter eating the scraps off of our child's plate?
It means you're a mother, but maybe you can change that narrative. Yes.
I mean, and that's where we reflect. We have to hold up that mirror. We have to look at the choices we're making for ourselves, because we are creating the environment that our children, this is where it's a big job. And as homeschooling mothers, as homeschooling parents, it's all the time, right? We're not outsourcing the influence for good or for better or worse, for
Yep.
ease or not ease, right? We're
Yep.
not outsourcing for several
Yeah.
hours a day. Who's modeling what, right? So it's really important to be able to notice those things. Notice the resistance you might have around something when it comes to food. Notice the ways in which maybe you're denying yourself something. And we want to do this noticing without judgment. We're not trying to find a solution in those moments. We're also solutions oriented. We're not trying to find a solution in those moments. We have to take a couple days or a week or longer to just observe what's happening.
Yeah.
And
it's amazing, that tool. I mean, that tool, people that know me know that that's what I always say first too, is to observe.
yeah,
And there's something about self-awareness. Step one for anything
it's
is
so
just
true.
self-awareness. And it's so, when you see it clearly, you go, okay, so why am I bringing the potato chips out that time of the month? Oh, that's why.
Yeah.
Or there's always a connection between things. So whether it's food or our behaviors, there's always a connection. So self-awareness, yeah, that's step number one.
It's so true. And then
Yeah.
what happens is once you see you'll start to see patterns.
Mhm.
And then the patterns are like the anchors. It's the information for your family. This is why
Mhm.
it's like you can look at all the memes and all the PDFs and the infographics and watch all the videos and take all the workshops, read all the books, but they'll all have some good nuggets in there.
Mhm.
But we have to start with what's going on in your family and in, what's your food story? What's the food story in your family? What is the daily rhythm? What's going on here? And 9 times out of 10, what families will tell me is that they will be annoyed that the kids are, that people are hungry, typically the kids, around like 4:30 p.m. But it happens every single day. And every day, a parent is annoyed that that's happening because they are making dinner.
Right.
Right.
So what's the plan? Yeah.
So we need to flip that on its head, and we need to ask, like, why are we so married to this concept of family dinner time? It has to be. We're all sitting down at 5 or 5:30 or 6 or whatever it is. And if you eat all this food an hour before, you're not going to be hungry for dinner. But I'm taking all this time to prepare this healthy dinner. I was on a text thread with a bunch of moms telling me like what they're preparing for their dinners. And I went out through all this effort or whatever it is. And what we can do is we can actually spare ourselves so much like agony. And this adds to the tumultuous relationship with food, right? It gets to the point where it's like, why am I even doing this? So then you yourself sit down at the table, there's no enjoyment. You're annoyed that people are not eating. You've made food that people don't want to eat. You are tired and stressed. It's the dinner time is the time of day where there's the least amount of bandwidth, right? Everybody has, it's like the least energy
hour. Yeah.
Yeah. It's that like witching hour. It's that you've done so much in your day already. And we're at our lowest typically with the highest expectations around food.
So what do you do then? What do you tell people if they're 4 o'clock?
It's working with families to understand, like, well, tell me about your schedule. Tell me about your rhythm. Like, is it possible? Like in our home, for example, breakfast is a pretty big meal. Like it's a pretty substantial meal. We are not needing to rush out of the house to get to school at 7:30 in the morning, right? Like we don't need to do that. And we have time and space. None of the activities we do start before 10 o'clock. I mean, at this stage, I remember when my son was younger and we used to go, we still go to a local farmer's market that opens at 10. But when he was like 2 or when he was a baby and he would wake up at 5, we were like, what in the world? Like, this is the least family friendly thing ever. We've had our whole day before the farmer's market even opens, but now that's just like, that's the rhythm we're in. And so this is my family, but it's honoring your family's rhythm. When is and the other thing is, I did a whole post on this. So if you want to go check my Instagram, you'll see it. But we have this thing where we pin these things together or like almost against each other. We assume they have to go together where they don't always have to. And that is food and connection. So there are times when we gather together where there's personal connection during eating. There are times when we just have personal connection. maybe like right before I started this call, I was sitting on the floor with my son doing Legos. We're chatting, we're connecting, we're doing something. There was no food involved, right?
Yeah.
There's plenty of time for that, whether you're driving in a car, you're going for a walk, you're wherever you are, laying in bed at bedtime, in the morning, anytime, right? And then there's times where you eat, where you're not connecting with other people.
Yeah.
And all of those are normal and all of those are okay. The goal, in my opinion, and what I hear from most families, is that they want to feel peaceful around food. Mm-hmm. They want to have a sense of trust and knowing that the choices they're making are honoring their family and that they feel solid in those choices, that they're not looking around at all the other families and thinking, should I be doing it that way? Should I be doing it that way? And, like that we are so unsure about how to do health and nutrition because we never really got that baseline. No one ever said to us, like, what do you really want to believe about your body? What do you want to know is true? And so, and if someone, when clients tell me that, this is like something we do always in the early time of working together. Like, what are the values? What do you want your children to know about their bodies? What do you want to know about your body? And then that's the anchor. That's where we build from.
Yeah. So how do you explore your values? Is there a way that you direct people to get clear on what their values are?
First we get into the food story. We get into kind of unpacking, and we look at the state. Like I will pull out statements that people say, and I will ask them, like, is that true for you? Mm. What do you believe about that now? Where did that come from? And we start to unpack, like, is this something that, and values can change, right? Like things can change at different seasons of life, but core values, what I hear most from people as we really start getting into it, is that they want to trust their bodies, and trusting the body has to do a little bit, or depending on the person, maybe more, with knowing some basics about how the body works. Right. And most of us don't do that. Most of us grew up in an environment where we outsource that. So again, how do we really understand what's happening with food we're putting in our bodies if we don't actually understand some basic mechanisms of digestion, of blood sugar balance or imbalance? If we don't know these things, then how can we trust the body? And then therefore, how can we help our children trust their bodies, right? Right. My son knows when he eats dairy, he gets constipated. Right. Yeah. He knows that. But sometimes he still chooses to eat dairy. Mm-hmm. And he knows that his stomach will hurt and he will be constipated. And he has to, like, in my opinion, because this is not an example of something that's going to have a violent reaction for him. This isn't one where I'm like, well, if you're going to have anaphylaxis, you'll have anaphylaxis. Like, that's not what we're saying here, right? Like, it's like, he will get constipated. And so we talk about it. We were in Yosemite National Park last week, and we went out for ice cream with friends, and they had one dairy-free option that he tasted and really didn't like. And so he chose to have dairy ice cream. Mm-hmm. And he had a really bad bellyache later that day. But we talked about it. And he was like, I'm still making this choice, because then it's his body and he knows what's happening there. We can talk about what it's like to eat sugary foods on an empty stomach, where there's no protein and no fat and no fiber to buffer that blood sugar spike. And we kind of act out blood sugar at this point. And so he can make those choices. But if the parent doesn't know anything about glucose or insulin, some very basics, and can't imagine like that blood sugar spike and then the extreme coming down, then we're just these like talking heads with like, just these one-liners, throwing these things at our children that don't help them actually really learn anything about their bodies, right?
Well, the culture really does not help us, because every time we bring our kids out anywhere in our part of the world, because it's not the case everywhere, but in our part of the world, there's always something that is trying to entice us. I had this conversation with a friend of mine who's a registered dietitian, and a few years back, we're Canadian, but I know it was happening in the United States. And the discussion was about how, I think it was cereal marketers had to consider how they were marketing to kids, and whether it was the responsibility of the people marketing it, the cereal creators like Kellogg's or whatever, and are they the ones responsible for children to be healthy, or is it the mother or the parent deciding what the child should eat, and whether we decide whether that food should be in our homes? And I mean, I think it's both. Having said that, the marketers are making it awfully difficult.
Yes.
And they are contributing to this assumption that, well, if you're a good mother, you're going to go get your kids, I don't know, Reese's Puffs. I forget what they're called. They look very delicious, I'm sure, if you're looking for sugar at breakfast time. But yeah, I mean, it's tricky.
It is a multi-billion-dollar industry.
Yeah.
That is 100% there to get you to buy their product.
Yeah.
And they will do that with the packaging. They will do that with their advertising, and they will do that with how something feels in the mouth, right? There's so much laboratory testing going on like the balance between sugar, fat, and salt in any food that creates the just the right amount of like addiction to the food, where it's a certain mouth feel. We're up against a lot, and I agree with you.
We are.
I think it is both, but I believe it is absolutely the responsibility of these systems.
Both the parents and but I remember Daniel Amen speaking. I was in a seminar that live once upon a time with him. I remember hearing him say, why do we make special occasions like birthdays the days where we go off the rails and eat all the worst stuff? And this is what my husband would say for years to me. Why are we giving them little loot bags of candy and then cake and ice cream and like everything that they love all in this 24-hour period? Because when they were much younger, that was what I did. And I remember one year somebody puking and just getting really sick because there was so much sugar. And my husband was always saying this, that why are we doing this? Then I hear Daniel Amen say, why are we making these occasions, the worst occasions for kids? So I gradually came to understand that this wasn't valuable, but it is the one day in the year that I let them choose whatever sugary cereal they want to eat. I grew up eating honeycombs and like you name it. I ate all the things every morning. And so they get it once a year. Now they don't actually want to do it. But for a little while there, one of the kids would choose Crave. I don't know if you've tried Crave.
No, I don't know what that is.
Kid you not, this thing is addictive. Like they know the addictive scale. Like you were speaking to, these cereal manufacturers actually create such an ability to enjoy the crunch of it, but there's also sort of a chewiness to it, and it's chocolate and it's got sugar, but it's unlike any cereal I've ever tried. I don't know that it's there anymore, but wow. The name. And it's true. It's like cocaine for 2-year-olds. Like it's just, so it's tricky because the kids go out into a grocery store in this part of the world and they see these, an aisle of boxes, and really boxes everywhere throughout the grocery store that they don't really need. To this day, Tuesdays are my groceries day. And the kids, someone had said to me yesterday that Monday is the worst day to try and find food in the house, and Wednesday is the best day. And my husband and I are both like, that's because there's more boxes of things here. But we teach cooking. We've always taught cooking. Our kids really, really can cook. They can cook better than I can in many different things. And yet they still default to the boxes are food mentality. And I'm not, if you see the kind of boxes I refer to, I'm not meaning the prepared food boxes that you could buy. But how do you do that? How do you deal with that kind of a constant onslaught of cultural, misguided ideas about what food is, and how you're going to be left out in isolation of all the good stuff if you don't go get or go buy that stuff for your kids?
I think to me, the answer is the same, no matter what topic we're talking about, right? Because in the world, we are going to be inundated with ideas and things and people and whatever it is that will not serve us. And so how do we raise children that can be more discerning through like one of the models that I talk about a lot is this idea of like, first we add. This was something that I did early on in my practice, where I was focusing more on like helping people like lose weight I don't do that anymore, but helping people lose weight, but like with a real food approach. So I was educating a lot on real food. And so the weight loss was sort of like the side effect. But what I would do is I would actually go into people's homes and we would take out everything in their cabinets and we would look at, okay, where are we first adding things? Where are we replacing things? Like if they had like fake butter or low fat yogurt, we would substitute it with like the real thing, right? And then what are we removing? What foods do we feel like at that third stage that we can remove? At this point, I don't even really get to removal as like an actual thing because it doesn't matter as much in the work that I do at this point. But it's the key part here is the adding. So where are we adding in more confidence? Where are we adding in more skills in the kitchen? Where are we adding in a new condiment, a new spice, using fresh herbs, using dried herbs, trying different cuisines, like having it be like an abundant experience. Because we're so wired for food to be this like scarcity thing. Yes, for ourselves. Exactly. And then with our children, it's like, okay, well, now they don't eat this food. Now they don't eat this food. This food came off the list. All they eat is this. It's a scarcity experience. And then for the parent who has a child that is a picky eater and doesn't want, and is expressing strong preferences, then it's a scarcity mindset for the adult because it's not enjoyable. It's just all like this suffering, punishing experience, right? So what we want to do is we want to add in more option so that sure, there's going to be this food on the shelf or this the sugary food opportunity. But if a child, first of all, has access to things like that on an ongoing basis with the ingredients and the experience that you want, like for example, I'll give you, this just happened last night. Oftentimes something I do, and I share this a lot on Instagram, is that for a moment of like, to help me transition into like dinner making mode or whatever it is, I often will make myself a really lovely beverage with some like sparkling water. Yesterday, I put in a little mint. I put in some frozen raspberries. My son came in, he saw me making, it was like in a wine glass. He saw me making this. He wanted to make his own concoction. So he took out raspberries and then he had like 17 cups and there were like measuring spoons and measuring cups and in my take on it is like I let him explore. I want him to want to be in the kitchen. And so sorry, I know we're at the hour. Do we have a few more minutes?
Oh yes, I just realized that my computer might die, so
okay. So he was making all these concoctions and then he said it needs a little something is were his words. And then he said it needs a little more sweetness. I'm going to get some sugar. And so he goes over to the baking area where we happen to have, and this is like you have what you have in your home, but we happen to have some unrefined like cane sugar. It's kind of brown, and he takes that and he's like muddling it in with the mint and the raspberries, and so he's adding sugar to his drink. And I am not saying anything about it, right? Like it's there because. And we will often bake and we will like we make, he'll say like, I want to make something fun and he'll find a recipe. He knows where the cookbooks are. He'll flip through. He actually puts Post-its in the cookbooks a lot. Like these are all what I call invitations, like helping your child engage with the food and with the kitchen space as they want. And so, and so there isn't scarcity around this. So if we're at a birthday party or if we're in a store or whatever, he doesn't feel compelled to want to take everything off the shelf, to eat 5 cupcakes, to, you know what I mean? Because it's just, his palate is broad enough at this point. And this is what I help families with. So if you're listening to this and you're like, well, my child would never do that. My child doesn't eat those foods. I want you to know that like all these things are possible, but because of that, it's not really a big deal. And he can make those choices and we're not in a position, we're not at birthday parties every single day, right? So it kind of works itself out for most families, but I think that's my answer to how do you handle the onslaught of all these things is you come into more of a joyful and abundant mindset around food. And if that's something that feels so far away for you in your personal relationship with food, I want you to know that was me once. And I absolutely know that it is possible to come into much more pleasure and much more joy. It just takes really massaging and looking at like what is the mindset, what are the values, what's restricting you, where are you feeling more like just actual restriction around food, how can we come out of that scarcity experience around it.
No, that discussion could be a full discussion, just that scarcity mindset. I know that because I know that myself as well. As an aspiring bulimic back at the time, I was an aspiring bulimic back when you were doing,
It's like it was something you felt like you couldn't.
I did try. It was a form of control, and it turns out I couldn't make myself sick. So that was useful. But so then I went towards the anorexic mindset instead. And, it's one or the other with a lot of Oreos. And then there were no Oreos and no food at all for days. So I identify with your story, by the way.
Yes.
Exactly. And the fascination with the weigh scale. That's why we don't own one. And in your discussion on scarcity, that is often the reason that we have, not the only reason, but one of the reasons why people have real issues with food is because we think we can't have it, or we might not get it again, which is interesting because our culture is constantly serving up stuff to us.
But that part is honoring the evolution. Like we that is very real.
Yeah.
Like the corporate job, one of the corporate jobs I had in New York was I worked for Google. Oh, and in the Google offices, there's food everywhere. There's little kitchens everywhere filled with snacks and filled with food. There's a served breakfast, there's a huge, abundant, amazing lunch. Wow. And you still see like this, a little bit of like hoarding, a little bit of like, there's not, that is evolutionary, and we have to really tune in to like, I'm a big believer in lineage, and that it's not a believer, it's, we now see this in science, but that we carry the cells and the lineage of what came before us. So even if the day you were born, there's never been a lack of food for a moment. And someone listening to this may be like, well, no, I actually, there has been real scarcity in my lifetime. So that's big, right? Mm-hmm. For me personally, there was never a threat of like, I wouldn't have food. That never happened in my life. But I know that in my history, it's there. And so I carry that, like I feel that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, interesting. I did actually, for the record, I did in college. Scarcity. Yeah, I did. There's maybe under a year anyways. I should have been going to the food bank. Too proud to do that. And I really think it was just God alone that brought food to me. And so they knew. So that you're not even speaking to someone randomly. It is me. Yes. I've been in that scenario.
And that's very real.
Yeah, it was very real to me. Now, why it would compel me to want to eat, I don't know. I can't think of Miss Vicky's potato chips there. That's something that I like. Why I would have a scarcity mindset now that many years later, well, it is what it is. But you would think it wouldn't be affecting it, except it still is. There's some element of it. And I'm fine.
It's very deep, and this is where like food is emotional. Like people want to put this category of like, oh, emotional eating, it's food is emotional. That's not like a pathology, emotional eating. Like food is emotional. Chips, for example, the salty, the crunchy, the something to like really chomp down on, to do with the jaw. Like this is a whole other class as well, but like understanding why we crave what we crave. What is the wisdom behind these food behaviors? Mm-hmm. And what I find in almost 100% of cases, and was very true with me, is that once we understand why, whether it's a health issue, a root cause, like when we can understand why we're doing what we're doing, it just naturally like sheds the weight.
Yeah, I know, the self-awareness
pressure. It's like a very like, oh, and the same thing happens when we can observe our children, but then combine the observations with some body-wise education and some understanding of why, like of cravings and emotional eating. When we can understand some of that why, we're just like, oh, okay, so you're eating a lot of these classical comfort foods, these bland food, these beige foods, these sweet foods, these cheesy foods. because you're actually needing more comfort. Where can we add?
Yeah.
We come back into the
Beautiful.
adding, like, where can
Mhm.
we add in more sweetness,
Mhm.
more love, more caring, more compassion? And then if that's hard for the parent, because there's wounds around that for the parent,
Mhm.
around self-love, around compassion, around, comfort, then we look into that, right? But we have a direction to understand why things are happening. And then we just learn that food is just one of those, it is a super powerful, but one of those portals to understanding why we do what we do, and how, and it's one of the many ways we can nourish ourselves.
That
And
is
that
so
scarcity
beautiful.
thing,
Yeah.
like, scarcity goes hand in hand with fear.
Yeah.
And we have many reasons in the world we live in to be fearful
Mhm.
of the choices we're making, of the health of our children, of our health. And so we want to apply all these rules to the food, because we are ultimately, at the root of it is like fear that our child will not be healthy,
Right.
fear that
Yeah.
there's
Mhm.
like a disease brewing, fear that they will grow up weighing more than we think is okay, and that they're going to then be bullied or
Mhm.
ridiculed, or life will be harder for them if they are in a bigger body, right? We have to look at that.
This is such a beautiful conversation. I would love to hear what resources you have available or
Sure.
how you engage families or homeschool parents.
Yeah. So one-on-one coaching is one of those methods where we dig deep in.
Mhm.
So this is where I get to know and kind of hold the hand of the person that I'm working with in session,
Mhm.
and then between sessions I use a certain app where we can message back and forth a lot, because I want to create this really active and tight container where we're really getting into this, and we're
Mhm.
unpacking it, and we're coming up with the solutions that work for these families. I
Yeah.
also run group coaching programs occasionally. I'll be running one in the fall. We have some travel and fun summer things coming up. And then available all the time are two resources that I think every family should start with. And the first one is the snack hack, which is just a free, like, you go to my website or you can go to my Instagram and you'll see it. It's just a free guide, because snacks are often a difficult point for families. Like, feeling like a snack vending machine, kids wanting snacks all the time. Like, how do we do
Yeah.
this? What do I buy? Where do I put it? They're eating too many snacks, all the things that come up with snacks. It's a whole system for how to do that. Where you put it in the food, in the house, how you put it away, and how you ultimately create a really strong sense of autonomy and agency and confidence around food through the snacks.
Mhm.
And then the next piece is the Joyful Family Meal Workshop,
Right.
which is just that. It's just me teaching an hour-long workshop where we get into the space, like the space in your home where you have the food, where you store the food, the fridge, the pantry, the actual kitchen and the tools, everything that is about the prep. And the prep of food is so much more than just that, like, hour or two before dinner's on the table. It's like,
Yeah.
where does food come from? How does it come in the house? Who's doing that? And really helping you connect the dots with what are like the real challenges there. And then the meal. And I have a framework for what is the Joyful Family Meal. So
Beautiful. Yeah.
that's a 1 hour workshop as well.
So where do we find you online?
So Deena Barselah at Instagram that's the primary place on social that I am. And then just going to my website, that's where you can get some of these classes and access some of these tools. And please message me, send me an email. It's just Deena@DeenaBarselah.com, or you can go through the thing on my website. I just love hearing from people. You can message me directly on Instagram. Going back and forth with people and hearing about you and learning about you is why I do this.
Yeah,
So.
me too. And that is so beautiful. You have a beautiful soul, and it's such a lovely conversation chatting with you.
This is amazing.
Yeah. So I'm going to put the links down below so anybody can join, or anybody that in the future is able to see that as well. And thank you for joining me today.
Thank you so much.
When you're talking about where does food come from, coincidentally, we have chickens, and so we have baby chicks that are being developed in our coop instead of us doing it in an incubation thing. And so there's a baby chick born last week, which was really exciting. But 2 weeks before, when people were taking eggs from the coop, they were taking the wrong eggs and making French toast with baby embryos. So we got a real training in where food comes from. Not
Wow.
recommended.
Fascinating. I love that. Yes. And so this is a perfect example of there's no one right way to do this, right? We learn about food, we get influenced by food in so many ways all the time. And it's just being able to recognize, like, where are these things coming from? And, how do we work with
From the
that?
chicken coop.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
Thank you for chatting with me today. I really appreciate it. Yes.
Thank you
You
so
have a
much.
lovely day.
Thank you, you too.